In Yu-Gi-Oh, cards will get erratas to their effects for a number of reasons. Usually it's to clean up their card text so it's not so long and convoluted, and sometimes it's to change effects or add limitations. And in this list we'll go over 10 of the cards who had the most amount of changes for whatever reasons. And at number 10, we have Kinetic Soldier. When this card was first released, it had the effect where, when this card battles with a warrior type monster, increase the attack and defense of this monster by 2,000 points only during damage calculation. Which is a pretty easy to understand effect, even with its old wording on it. So in its first errata, its effect was changed to be a little bit more simplified, which simply says, when battling a warrior type monster, this card gains 2,000 attack and defense during damage calculation only. So basically, same thing, just less words, and that'll be the gist of a lot of these cards on this list. And I won't bore you by reading out every single little change. There was one other little thing about this card though. Its attribute was changed from Earth to Light. Yeah, that doesn't happen very often. It is incredibly rare that a card's attribute or type changes during an errata, and Kinetic Soldier was one of those very few cards, because it was given out as a World Championship promotional card, and then when they released it in normal packs, they gave it an updated card text and a completely different attribute. But that's not all. This card has had a total of 5 erratas to it, which make it tied with the bottom 4 spots on this list, as this card got another errata, where its attribute was changed back to Earth, and a comma was removed from its card text. Now, you see what happened was they accidentally changed its attribute to Light. It was supposed to be an Earth monster all along, and this has only happened one other time with Nitro Warrior, where it was originally printed as a Fire type, and then was misprinted in its second set to be of the Wind attribute. So even though there's 2 different versions of Kinetic Soldier out there with 2 different attributes, all of the other erratas have Earth as well, so that's the attribute it's supposed to be. Although Kinetic Soldier's erratas don't stop there. It got a 3rd errata to update its problem-solving card text, then a 4th errata to do it again, and then a 5th errata which changed its name from Kinetic Soldier to Cypher Soldier. Because you see, in Japanese, its name is actually supposed to be Cypher Scout. And with the new Cypher archetype being released, Cypher Soldier retroactively gained a whole bunch of new support cards, which didn't actually work on him since his name was Kinetic Soldier. So when they release cards like Cypher Wing, which has the effects that interact with Cypher monsters, it had to specifically state that it works on Cypher monsters or Kinetic Soldier, since it was supposed to be part of that archetype. So instead of having little stipulations to every single Cypher card, they just changed the name of Kinetic Soldier to Cypher Soldier, which they were much more willing to do nowadays than they were in the past. So Cypher Soldier has had a colorful history of changes, despite the fact that its effect has not changed a single time over all 5 of its erratas. And at number 9, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This card received a total of 5 erratas, and most of them were just fixing its text, since it's such an old card and had some of that old textbook wording, where in its very first version it forgot to say that it cannot be normal summoned or set. So in its original text, was that it could be special summoned from your hand by banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. And then you could pay 1,000 life points to send all cards in the field and in both players' hands to the graveyard, then inflict 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard by this effect. And this ultra powerful card basically created the ban list just so they could get rid of that card from the game. Then, even though this card was banned for so long, it kept getting re-released, and then they would update its card text, where they basically just gave it proper problem-solving card text, all the way until its 5th errata, where they completely changed its effect. It still had the same summoning condition, but it had a little restriction added to it. One of them was that it only inflicted 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to your opponent's graveyard by its effect, rather than all cards sent to the graveyard. And its other new restriction was you cannot activate other cards or effects during the turn you use this card's effect. It was due to this huge restriction to this card that it actually got unbanned, since part of the reason this card was so strong was its combo potential to completely screw your opponent over. Not being able to use any other card effects the turn you use this effect meant you couldn't use the card during the same turn you set up your graveyard, nor could you use any other card effects after using this effect, which essentially turned its original combo potential into a 3-turn strategy, which significantly slowed it down to the point where it's no longer broken. Not quite a whole bunch of colorful changes like what Cypher Soldier got, but this card did have its effect changed, while also receiving a whole bunch of updates its original effect before they threw that out. And at number 8, we have Ryko, the Lightsworn Hunter. This is a flip effect monster who's had a total of 5 erratas in his lifetime. Now, this is an interesting card. It basically got a buff to its effect with its errata, while also not really changing what this card was meant to do. So in its original form, this card had a flip effect, where when it was flipped face up, you could use its effect to target one card on the field and destroy it, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, which was actually a pretty powerful effect back in the day. And Lightsworn decks love to send cards from their deck to the graveyard, and destroying cards is always good. In fact, it's partly because of Ryko that people started setting their spell and trap cards during their main phase too, because if they set them during main phase 1, they could be destroyed if they attacked into this card. And in its original text, the way it destroyed the card was just by saying it can destroy one card on the field. So in its first errata, it was changed to say you can select one card on the field and destroy it, which was then changed in its second errata to you can target one card on the field. Basically, its effect was changed to say that this card does in fact target, in order to remove some ruling confusions, as back in the day, not every card which could target said that it could target. Then in its third errata, its effect was changed to say that after you destroy a card, send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, in order to remove any other kind of ruling confusions. Because you see, the fact that this card had an effect which happened immediately after it destroyed a card, meant it could cause other cards to miss timing. I remember back in the days of YuGiOh Online, when I was playing my Shining Hero Gate deck, which revolved around Elemental Hero the Shining, it had a floating effect which would activate when it was destroyed. That would allow you to add 2 elemental heroes that were banished to your hand. And I always hated attacking into Ryko because they would always destroy my Shining and cause it to miss its timing, so it wouldn't be able to add any cards back. And a lot of cards missed timing back in the day. So this card really got people to know the rules a lot better when it comes to timing, and the difference between when and if effects. Then in its fourth errata, they really drove home the fact that the effects happen back to back, so that they can force cards to miss timing, as it was changed to say, apply these effects in sequence, target a card in the field and destroy it, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. That was all the way until its fifth errata, where they completely changed their mind on this long-standing effect, and did 3 things to the card. First, they gave it a flip type distinction, next to the fact that it was a beast and effect monster, since flip effect monsters themselves are their own special type of monster, and benefit from a whole bunch of support which specifically only works on flip monsters. Then they changed its effect to apply both of its effects simultaneously, and this little ruling makes it so it no longer causes Elemental Hero the Shining to miss its timing, since it would destroy the card and send 3 cards from your top of the deck to the graveyard at the exact same time. However, at the same time, they gave it a buff, where the card no longer targets. The card now just destroys one card on the field, which means it can now destroy cards which are normally untargetable, like Obelisk the Tormentor for example, where in the past they would have been immune to this card's effect since it had to target. So that's why this card is a little weird. They simultaneously nerf the effect by having them both happen simultaneously, after having 2 iterations of this card specifically saying that they happen in sequence. And then they buff the card by removing its targeting condition after having 2 different versions of this card specifically changed to say that it does target. Basically, its last errata was just to completely undo everything that was set up by its first 4, in order to basically give it a new effect that also basically does the same thing, and the card doesn't really see play in Lightsworn decks anymore, so it doesn't really matter anyway. And at number 7, we have Toon World. This card had a total of 5 erratas, plus 1 if you count the errata this card had before it was translated into English in the TCG, giving it a total of 6 erratums. Now, the very first effect of Toon World, it had the effect where you had to pay 1,000 life points to activate the card. Then, you had to pay 500 life points during each of your standby phases to keep the card on the field. And if the card on the field was destroyed, you would gain all the life points back that you had paid for its maintenance cost. And in the first errata of this card, they changed all of that effect into just pay 1,000 life points to activate this card, which is quite the change in card text. And that's the version we got in English in the very first set that it was released. And then the card just got a whole bunch of updates to its card text, basically just different versions of wording of the card in the exact same way. And it was all very simple, just pay 1,000 life points to keep this card on the field. With some small changes like changing the text that it was a magic card into a spell card, when they did that for all spell cards back in the day. And nothing else really happened with this card. It's kind of amazing this card got so many erratas without changing its effect, but I guess it's kind of standard practice for cards that are iconic. And at number 6, we have Future Fusion. This card has had a total of 6 erratas, but only 1 effect change. In its original form, the effect of this card was basically, After the card was activated, you choose a fusion monster and then send the materials of that fusion monster from your deck to the graveyard. Then, 2 standby phases after you activate this card, you would special summon that fusion monster and attach this card to it. And Future Fusion was really good in decks that wanted to get a whole bunch of cards in the graveyard immediately, so it was banned after a couple of years. Although it wasn't banned immediately, and it did stay around for a while, so we got some erratas to the card text. One that changed the text, which told you to select a fusion monster from your fusion deck into the extra deck, back when they changed the name of the fusion deck to the extra deck. Then it just got a couple of other updates in similar veins, until its 5th errata, when they actually changed its effect. Its effect was still basically the same. You got to bring out a fusion monster after 2 standby phases. However, the difference was, you didn't actually send the monsters from your deck to the graveyard until 1 standby phase after you activated the card, instead of sending them all there immediately after using the card. So with this change, your opponent would have a full turn to destroy this card in order to prevent you from sending cards from your deck to the graveyard, which gave it enough counterplay where they were able to unban this card and eventually unlimit it, since that slowed it down enough where people just didn't play the card anymore. And then after its 5th errata, it got 1 more errata to shorten the text of graveyard to GY, and that's it. Not all these erratas are super interesting. I'd say a vast majority of them are just normal text changes, but even with just normal text changes, this is one of the most errated cards in the game. And at number 5, we have Brain Control. This card is at a grand total of 6 erratas, with one of them being a change to the card's mechanics. Now, in the first form of this card, it had the effect to pay 800 life points to select and take control of 1 face-up monster on your opponent's side of the field until the end phase. This card was then changed over the years to kind of clean up its card text a little, changing the word select to target, changing the word life points to LP, and a few other minor changes until its 6th errata, where this card was given a limitation, where you can only target a monster your opponent controls that can be normal summoned or set. Essentially, this makes it so you can't steal extra deck monsters with this card anymore, and was enough of a nerf to the card that it was able to be unbanned, and currently sees almost no competitive play at all, despite the fact that previously weaker versions of this card, like Mind Control, are currently limited to 1 for being too useful. This was just another case of a very iconic card, which was also a banned card that got re-released a whole bunch of times. They just updated its card text with problem-solving card text stuff before nerfing its effect with an errata. And at number 4, we have Y Dragonhead. This card has had a total of 6 erratas, with a change to the card's type, and a very rare buff to its effect. Now, the original version of this card was pretty standard Union Monster stuff. You could equip it to its specific Union Monster equip card, which in Y Dragonhead's case was X Head Cannon, and while it was equipped to that monster, it gained 400 attack and defense. If that monster would be destroyed by battle, you could destroy the equipped card instead, and once per turn, it could special summon itself as an equipped card to your side of the field, although not on the same turn that it equipped itself, and you can only have 1 Union Monster equipped to a monster at a time. That's a pretty long mouthful of card text to basically say this card can only equip itself to 1 specific monster, and that 1 specific monster will just gain 400 attack and defense. Of course, there was other uses to this card other than its pretty mediocre Union effect, but those don't really have too much to do with its erratas. Now, a lot of the erratas to this card were just cleaning up its text to explain what it does in less words, or to clarify some things. Like in some of its older card texts, it would say that it could become a monster again, when referring to its effect as special summon itself as an equipped card, which is a pretty funny card text if you ask me. Anyways, nothing really changed about this card all the way until its 6th errata, where this card was given the effect tag, as before this errata it only had machine/union in its card text, and kind of left out the fact that it was also an effect monster. Pretty minor thing that didn't really change anything. There was one other thing that did change with this card in its 6th errata, and that was the removal of the "a monster can only be equipped with 1 Union Monster at a time" clause. You see, before this errata, pretty much all Union Monsters had that little clause to their effect, and it was when they started releasing the ABC Dragon Buster cards that they just retroactively removed this restriction from Y Dragonhead and Z Metal Tank, who actually shares a spot on the list for having the exact same changes done to that card as a way to kind of buff Union Monsters. Since Union Monsters were almost never played for their Union effects, there wasn't really a reason to have that restriction on them anymore. So with them releasing a new set with good Union Monsters and cards, they buffed the 2 Union cards which also benefited from that new wave of support, by removing the restriction on their Union equips. This, however, does not retroactively remove the restrictions to all Union Monsters though. If a card says in its card text that only 1 Union Monster can be equipped at a time, then that's still the case. So a new wave union monster can be equipped to the same monster as another new wave union monster, but if they have an old wave union monster equipped to them, then you cannot equip one of the new waves to it as well, as the old one will restrict you from adding any other union monsters to them. Although union monsters are pretty bad, so no one's really using the old ones anyway, so this isn't really a concern. And at number 3, we have Catapult Turtle. This card has had a total of 6 erratas, with one of them changing the functionality of the card. The first version of this card was overly worded to explain its effect, which was pretty common in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! They basically had to explain some of the rules of the game in the card text. So its very first version read, offer one monster on your side of the field as a tribute to inflict direct damage equal to half of the tribute monster's attack to your opponent's life points. Monsters used for a tribute summon or that are offered as tributes due to other card effects are excluded. So in the first errata of this card, they just removed that last sentence completely, as it's not needed. They also removed the offer one monster on your side of the field as a tribute thing to just tribute one monster, like they did with all other cards that told you to offer a monster as a tribute. And then they turned the direct damage into just inflict damage, since all effect damage is basically direct damage. It wasn't really needed to explain that on the card text. Then it got a couple of other minor tweaks to it, with its 5th errata stating that it inflicts damage to your opponent equal to the tribute monster's attack on the field, which could be a buff to the card depending on how you look on it, as most cards that inflict damage based on a monster's attack only count their attack from the graveyard. And then its 6th errata was a nerf to its effect, as they slapped a soft once per turn on it. Whereas before, you could use its effect as many times per turn as you wanted, and it was involved in some FTKs in the past, so giving it a once per turn on its effect basically stopped that from happening completely, and you'd have to use something like Cannon Soldier instead. And at number 2, we have the Twin-Headed Behemoth, who got a grand total of 7 erratas. One of them used to change its card effect in order to resolve a Ruling's Nightmare that this card created with its old text. Now, in its original card text, it stated that if this monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, this monster will be special summoned with an attack and defense of 1000 during the end phase of the turn. And then it also went on to say this effect can only be used once during the current duel, making this the first card in the game which had a once per duel effect, which is why they didn't really word this card correctly. Because you see, based on its wording, this copy of the card can only use the effect once per duel. But if you had other copies of the card, then those would also all have their own once per duel effects. So essentially, you could use the effect 3 times per duel if you had 3 copies. Where this caused a Ruling's Nightmare is, what do you do if one of the cards is returned to your deck? How do you keep track of which ones have already activated their effects that duel? Which is why they tried to rectify this card by a whole bunch of erratas and by limiting the card to 1 per deck. So its first change was you can only use the effect once in the duel, which still had the same problems as the original text. It just cleared up the card text a little. In its 4th errata, it was changed to, each player can only use the effect of Twin-Headed Behemoth once per duel, which did finally fix the problem. They basically invented the hard once per turn clause, which involves literally printing the name of the card in the card's text to signify that you can only use the effects of that card's name once per duel. Then in its 6th errata, they removed the each player part and just said that you can only use the effect of Twin-Headed Behemoth once per duel, since the wording implied that your opponent could use it as well. And in its 7th and final errata, all they did was clarify its conditions for activating its effect, saying that if this card is sent to the graveyard because it was destroyed on the field and sent there this turn, then you could use its effect. So they only changed the functionality of this card 1 time when they properly gave it a hard once per duel effect, since you can't really have soft once per duel effects like it originally had, which it wasn't supposed to have, and only had those rulings because they kind of made the card incorrectly. This is one of the few times where a card was placed on the ban list because of its card text being too confusing. And at number 1, we have Necrovalley, who has had a grand total of 7 erratas. However, the functionality of this card changed about just as many times as its text. In its first version, the card was a magic card, which had the effect that, as long as this card remains face up on the field, all effects of magic, trap, or effect cards that involve graveyards are negated, and neither player can remove cards in the graveyard from play. In addition, increase the attack and defense of all monsters that include Gravekeeper in their card name by 500. So its original card text was kind of vague in what it actually did, as it just negated the effects of cards which involved the graveyard, which could really mean anything. Like, if you discard a card, does that mean it involves the graveyard? So a lot of the erratas of this card was to more or less really crack down on what exactly that line of text meant. So in its first errata, all mentions of magic cards were just changed to spell card. so nothing really changed there. It wasn't until its second errata where they started clarifying its card text a little, where now it said cards that affect a card or cards in the graveyard are negated, rather than cards that simply involve the graveyard. So simplifying it to cards that affect the graveyard does kind of limit the scope a little bit more than just cards that involve it, but it doesn't stop there. In its third errata, they removed a couple of sentences that weren't really needed, like how this card needs to be face up on the field, and that it increases the attack of Gravekeeper monsters, rather than being specific that it affects monsters with Gravekeeper in their card name. In its fourth errata, its effect was changed to negate the effects of cards that target a card in either player's graveyard, and that cards from either player's graveyards could not be removed from play. As before, it only ever talked about the graveyard, and never really specified if it worked for both players' graveyards. And it also changed the wording to cards which target stuff in the graveyard, rather than things that simply affect cards in the graveyard, which more significantly narrowed down what this card actually did once again. In its fifth errata, its effect was changed to cards in either player's graveyards cannot be affected by card effects except for their own effects, which really seemed like a step backwards in trying to specify what this card was, as it went back to cards that affect the graveyard, rather than stuff that targets cards in the graveyard. And it did also exclude monsters who affect themselves in the graveyard, which meant monsters could activate their graveyard effects in a limited capacity. Then what do you know, in its sixth errata, it got another clarification to its card text, or a change actually, where its new effect was negate any card effect which would move a card in the graveyard, other than itself, to a different place. It still had the effect where cards cannot be banished from the graveyard, so this allowed you to activate more graveyard effects than previously, like Glow Up Bulb for example. But a lot of graveyard effects require you to banish themselves in order to activate their effects, so it still shut down most of those. But it was a lot more specific on what it actually did now, as it's a lot easier to quantify effects that move cards around, rather than what it means to affect cards in the graveyard. Then, in its seventh errata, it got a change again. Or a buff, actually. It still had the same effects as the sixth errata: cards in the graveyard cannot be banished, negate any card effects that would move cards in the graveyard somewhere else, but they removed the effect of cards being allowed to move themselves, which meant no more Glow Up Bulb effects. And on top of that, they gave it an extra effect to negate any card effect that changes types or attributes in the graveyard, which seems to be specifically designed to counter cards like Zombie World, which changes the types of all monsters in the graveyards to zombie type. And because of this seventh errata, this is one of the few cards in the game to actually receive a buff through its errata, as most of the times cards only ever get nerfs if an errata changes the card's functionality. And the only thing that stayed consistent about this card's effects for all of its erratas was the fact that it always gave Gravekeeper monsters 500 attack and defense, and it always prevented cards in the graveyard from being banished. It was the other effect of stopping cards from working with the graveyard that took a few tries for them to finally get it right, which easily makes Necrovalley the most changed card in the game, as almost all of its erratas were more than just simple text changes to decrease the bloat of extra words for the card, and basically changed how the card functioned multiple times over its lifespan, to the point where I'm pretty sure Necrovalley has had the most effect changes of any other card in the game, as well as having the most erratas. Alright, and that's the video. There were a lot of cards which got very simple erratas to their card text, and a lot of others that they never bothered to update their card text. So very few cards ever get more than 1 or 2 changes. The ones on this list are the absolute exceptions for getting as many as they have. So if you have any ideas for videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And also, did you know only 32.2% of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel?